Since the pandemic started in March 2020, the Philippines suffered an economic recession that was not seen since the end of the Second World War in 1945. All indicators point to the tragic picture of the economy. The gross domestic product that, for the past decade, has shown promising levels of growth contracted by 9.6% in 2020 compared to the year prior. With the closure of various economic activities, household consumption fell by 7.9%. Unemployment rose together with hunger and poverty incidences. The restrictions that had to be put in place as the pandemic raged on gravely injured the service sector that, for the last couple of decades, has dominated the Philippine economy. Interestingly, as more and more people are plunged in abject poverty, Filipino billionaires actually got richer by 30%. This picture is demonstrative not only of the persistent and severe economic inequality in the Philippines, but also of the inherent callousness of the Philippine economy.
But what led us to this distressing situation?
How can a country with so much natural resources, dynamic, educated, and young population be in such level of economic trouble?
Let us talk about that and more in another episode of
Hindi Na Bago Yan.
I am Vec Alporja.
I am Aaron Maliar.
And I am Lee Candelaria.
And you are listening to Podcasts, Conversations on Philippine History, Politics, and Society.
Okay, so ang lala talaga ng sitwasyon ng ekonomiya ng Pilipinas kahit noon pa. Pero ayun nga, because of the pandemic, yung mga problemang umaaligid-aligid lang, sumambulat talaga bigla.
Yes, so at this point, mag-e-election na naman, kailangan natin mapag-usapan, kagaya ng nabanggit sa intro, bakit tayo umabot sa ganito? 'Di ba? What are the flaws in the system and what should the government do to get us out of this mess? So for this episode, we are joined by the economist and Rappler columnist who also recently completed his PhD economics from UP School of Economics, JC Punongbayan.
And JC had a lot of insights about what went wrong on the economic management of the current administration, even before the pandemic. So nabanggit niya, even in 2019 or 2018, the government had been missing targets here and there. So what are these targets? So halimbawa, yung sa flagship program nila na Build, Build, Build. What happened here? Sabi ni JC.
So itong Build, Build, Build project ng Duterte administration ay sinasabi nga nila na ito daw yung flagship economic project nila. At nung nilaunch ito, nung bandang 2017, ay very ambitious yung goals nila. Sabi nila, gagastos daw sila ng 7, 8, or 9 trillion pesos on various infrastructure projects ranging from highways, railway systems, bridges, etc. Ang focus talaga nila yung mga hard infrastructure projects. Pero sa mga nakalipas na taon, nakita natin na parang nag-underdeliver sila doon sa infrastructure projects na ipinangako nila noong umpisa. At nakita natin yun dahil unang-una, yung listahan nila ng infrastructure projects ay binago nila over time. Noong 2019, bago nagkaroon ng pandemic, ay umamin yung Director General ng NEDA or National Economic and Development Authority na kinailangan nilang palitan yung ilang mga big projects tulad ng mga inter-island bridges sa Visayas at Mindanao dahil hindi daw naging feasible after all yung mga proyektong iyon. At over time, yung mga big infrastructure projects ay nawala sa listahan at pinalitan nila ng mga smaller, much more doable infrastructure projects. And nakita din natin na doon sa latest iteration ng kanilang main list ng build, build, build projects, parang may mga kasama na dito na hindi na lang siya hard infrastructure projects. For example, yung National ID System and even yung Virology Institute na itinatatag nila in the middle of the pandemic ay isinama na doon sa listahan ng Build, Build, Build. Marami ding mga infrastructure projects ng previous administrations ang sinali nila dito sa current list nila. So for example, yung Skyway Stage 3 and then yung LRT Line 2 extension papunta sa Antipolo and then yung NLEX, SLEX Connector Road, lahat yan ay mga proyekto ng mga nakarang administrasyon, specifically yung previous Aquino administration. So maganda sana actually yung purpose nitong build, build, build kasi napag-iiwanan talaga tayo sa infrastructure sa rehiyon. Kailangan talaga nating i-ramp up. Pero more than simply building new bridges and highways and other hard infrastructure projects, sinasabi ng ilang transport experts and urban design experts na siguro kailangan smart infrastructure ang itayo natin na hindi siya car-centric kung hindi more pedestrian-friendly, mga biker-friendly infrastructure projects. Yung mga ganong klase, hindi yung puro nakatuon lang sa welfare ng mga may kotse dahil napaka-exclusive at hindi siya nababagay doon sa goals ng gobyerno for inclusive growth.
Ayan, yung Build, Build, Build project ng Duterte administration was reminiscent of the infrastructure program of the Marcos dictatorship. For many reasons. Una, syempre, yung focus on hard infrastructure. Ito din yung laging fina-flout ng mga Marcos supporters hanggang ngayon. Pero ang tanong nga dyan, at what cost? At pangalawa, paano ba pinupondohan ang mga proyektong ito and more importantly, sinong nakinabang? Dito papasok yung debt-driven character ng mga proyektong ito. So, paano ginawa to? Let's hear from JC.
Marami doon sa mga proyektong yun ay debt-driven. Parang marami kasing mga bagong loans na kinuha yung Marcos dictatorship at the time, bumabaha ng pera doon sa international credit markets at nagkaroon ng opportunity yung Marcos dictatorship para mangutang on a very large scale at isa yun sa mga pinagkakagastusan yung mga infrastructure projects. Pero maraming mga pag-aaral ang nagpakita na naging inefficient yung infrastructure projects na yun at marami ay kinurakot lang at overdesigned at pinirahan in many instances. For example, yung Bataan Nuclear Power Plant, milyong-milyong dolyar ng komisyon ang nakuha ni Marcos tsaka si Herminio Dicini na isa sa mga cronies niya. No? Nakikita natin ngayon doon sa Build, 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 actually marami dito ay may ilang mga proyekto na binuo din gamit yung mga foreign loans. For example, yung mga bagong mga bridges sa Maynila. Well, hindi nga loans kundi Chinese grants. Kakunti lang yung mga Chinese loans na yun naman, yung mga Chinese loans, nag-overpromise din yung Chinese government at the beginning of the Duterte administration pero hindi naman natuloy yung marami doon.
So paano nagawa ni Marcos yung kabi-kabilang infrastructure projects niya? From the Philippine Heart Center to the Cultural Center to the defunct Bataan Nuclear Power Plant hanggang sa San Juanico Bridge. So simple lang, utang. So at this time, tulad ng sinabi ni JC, booming ang international credit market. And Marcos really grabbed this opportunity to amass money. So linawin lang natin, hindi naman inherently masama ang utang panlabas. So as a matter of fact, there are a lot of countries running on deficit. But we have to remember that debts are always about extent. So dapat match yung amount na inuutang at well projected ang return of investment to make sure that the debt can be managed. So the worst debt crisis in the Philippines happened in the 1980s, in the last few years of the Marcos dictatorship. Bakit? Kasi sabi din sa isang Rappler article ng guest natin na si JC kasama si Kevin Mandrilla, ang utang ng Pilipinas from 1977 to 1982 ay lumobo from $8.2 billion to $24 billion. So, threefolds yan. At itong mga utang na to, syempre may interest yan, So, kapag ganito na yung extent ng utang, baliktad na yung nangyayari. Kasi supposedly, governments borrow money to boost economic growth. So, makapag-invest sa mga promising industries, sa mga infrastructure, at sa social services. Pero kung excessive ang pangungutang, then the government money, instead of, going to these services, goes to pay interest instead. So, interest pa lang hindi pa yung principal. So, this excessive borrowing basically incapacitates the state to invest in things that really matter. At nung panahon na to, nitong debt crisis ng 1983, less money circulated domestically. Tapos, sumabay pa yung political turmoil brought about by the assassination of Ninoy Aquino. Kaya naman kung ano man yung initial growth na na-achieve ng Marcos administration in the early years of his regime, lahat yon ay undone. It was all undone toward the end of his administration. And the Philippines, for the first time since the war ended, actually registered a negative growth.
So Marcos really left the country in deep debt trouble when he left in 1986. Kaya lang, di naman din faultless yung pumalit sa kanya. The problem with the liberal democratic government of Corazon Aquino and all that followed it is that they adopted the good debtor model. So ibig sabihin, automatically, A huge chunk of our budget pie goes to debt repayment na sana ay napupunta sa basic social services like education, transportation, employment, and health. Samantalang, after the EDSA revolution, it was actually an option na hindi nabayaran tong mga utang na ito kasi utang naman to ng diktador, hindi to utang ng sambayan ng Pilipino.
Yeah. Yes. Talagang makikita in the past decades that the government expenditure of the Philippines on key services like health is way below the global average. Halimbawa, in 2019, the health expenditure was only pegged at around 4% of the GDP, while the global average is around 6.5%. So there really is a perennial problem on budget prioritization in Philippine government.
Yes, that's why some critique and activists would actually lament itong tinatawag nilang neoliberal economic model reflected on, very conservative government spending and privatization of some services like transportation. Halimbawa, the previous administration of Noynoy Aquino also had a penchant, with a public-private partnership. So yung mga infrastructure projects noon, halimbawa, PPP ang nagpondo at nagpatakbo dyan. At according to JC, may advantage naman ito kasi mas naging efficient yung proseso ng pagbibuild ng mga infrastructure na to at yung pag-proceed ng mga proyekto. Pero, sabi ni JC, this model was actually altered in the current government. So let's hear it from him.
Doon sa previous administration, matatandaan natin na umasa sila doon sa public-private partnerships kung saan yung pribadong sektor yung actually magtatayo ng mga infrastructure projects. They will operate it for some time and then at a certain point, several years later ay ipapasa na nila sa gobyerno kapag nabawi na nila yung kanilang initial na investment. Nakita natin na actually ito yung medyo mas mabilis nga. Once na ma-approve itong ganitong klaseng PPP projects, mabilis na siyang nagro-roll out. Nakita yan natin doon sa ibang mga proyekto na nangyari doon sa previous administration kung saan very much involved yung for example mga kumpanya tulad ng San Miguel. Sa grupo ni Manny Pangilinan ay marami silang naipatayo sa loob ng maikling panahon. Kumpara sa mga proyekto na gobyerno mismo ang gumawa ay mukhang mas mabagal. So parang na-overestimate ng Duterte administration yung kakayahan nila na magtayo ng ganitong klaseng infrastructure projects by themselves using foreign funding. And marami doon ay galing actually sa mga Pilipino mismo mula sa mga domestic borrowings. Medyo na-emphasize lang sa balita yung external borrowings mula sa mga bansa tulad ng China pero actually karamihan ng mga bagong mga utang ay galing din sa mga Pilipino. Kasi to be fair naman ay nagkaroon ng economic growth somehow sa mga nakalipas na taon at marami mga may pondo at kapag nangungutang ang gobyerno sa pamamagitan ng pag-i-issue ng mga treasury bonds and treasury bills ay nakakalikom sila ng malalaking halaga mula sa mga Pilipino themselves. Misconception nga yun na yung paglobo ng utang natin recently ay mula sa ibang mga bansa or sa multilaterals pero actually mula ito sa mga Pilipino din.
So the current government has also made a borrowing spree comparable to that of Marcos. But as an economist, JC was actually more concerned on how the borrowed fund was being used and managed. Kasi kung matatandaan, ito yung naging problema nung panahon ni Marcos. Yung pera ng gobyerno, both from debt and revenue, ay hindi naman naibuhos sa mga promising industries o sa mga proyekto that can foster inclusive prosperity. Sa halip ay napupunta sa mga crony ni Marcos, yan nga tinatawag nating crony capitalism, or sa mga Marcos mismo, kasi di ba si Imelda noon tinatawag siyang si Miss 10%, kasi bawat project meron siyang 10% na cut, di ba?
So, ngayon, in this government, bukod sa mga umuusbong na problema ng graft and corruption, mukhang mas malaki yung problema on the incapacity of the government to manage, spend, and use the money. Ang isang pinaka-poignant na manifestation yan, sabi ni JC, sa ngayon ay yung nangyari sa Bayanihan 2, kung saan government agencies, including the DOH, for example, severely underspent. So, they missed the deadline set by Congress in using these funds. There was no effort to make a resolution to extend it or something. So, yung pera na pwede sanang inilaan para i-compensate yung health workers, mag-procure ng testing kits, vaccines, other hospital supplies, o kahit sa stimulus packages to jumpstart the economy again, na-revert lang sa treasury. So, sayang.
Yes, and while we're on the topic of government funds, its sources and its use, maganda rin na pag-usapan yung usapin ng buwis or tax. Aside from Build, 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 the current administration, in its initial years, also introduced the Comprehensive Tax Reform Program. So what are its characteristics? Let's listen to JC.
Yes, so pagdating dun sa tax reform, isa din ito sa mga naging cornerstone ng Duterte administration at very early on ay ipinangako nga nila yung isang comprehensive na tax reform package simula doon sa train law na napirmahan by the latter part of 2017 at inimplement noong 2018 kung saan basically they rationalize yung tax system especially yung sa pagbubuwis dun sa incomes ng mga Pilipino. For example, kapag ang kita mo ay hindi hihigit sa 250,000 pesos, ay wala ka nang kailangan na bayaran na personal income tax. Sinabi nga nila, yun yung isa sa mga peg nila noon na marami nang hindi magbabayad ng tax kapag napasa yung train law. So bagamat may ganong klaseng magandang objective naman siya, actually binawi din siya doon sa ilang mga polisiya within the train law itself na mukhang mas nahirapan yung mga mahihirap din. For example, yung pagtataas doon sa excise tax or buwis sa mga produktong petrolyo at that time na sumabay doon sa pagtaas ng international oil prices. And so mataas na oil prices sa domestic market, international market, tapos sinabayan pa nung implementation ng train law. So doble-doble yung pahirap, especially doon sa mga gumagamit ng petrolyo. Although sabi nila yung mga mayaman naman daw ang gumagamit niyan. Pero actually, paano na yung public transport na sinasakyan ng masang Pilipino din? So hindi totoo na yung mga ganong klaseng nakapaloob sa train law ay masasaktan yung mga mayaman. Bagkus actually yung mga mahihirap actually ang nasaktan doon.
So since the American colonization, we can generally characterize the Philippine taxation system as somewhat regressive and inequitable. So the poor and the middle class are more burdened than the rich through both direct and indirect taxation. So in the train law, the reforms incorporated primarily targeted income tax. So papaliitin ng income tax na individually binabayaran natin habang binubuwisan ang ibang mga produkto at serbisyo. So in its initial implementation, JC noted how the train law actually exacerbated various problems.
Sinasabi ng ilang mga ekonomista na yung train law, yung implementation sa 2018, ay isa sa mga salik doon sa matinding pagtaas ng presyo or yung tinatawag natin na inflation at that time. Kung saan mula sa mas mababa sa 4% na inflation kada buwan ay lumagpas yun ng 6%. So actually malaking bagay yun dahil ang target ng gobyerno ay dapat hindi lumagpas ng 4% ang inflation rate. At yan ang main goal ng Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas to stabilize prices in the economy. Pero parang naging out of their control kasi nagsabay-sabay yung mga factors like yung oil prices, yung train law, and then on top of all this ay yung presyo ng bigas din kasi nagkaroon ng parang mini rice crisis at that time. Matatandaan natin na si Secretary Piñol ng Department of Agriculture ay kumakain ng kanin na may bukbok or yung weevils para safe daw yung kainin. Siguro yung timing ng train law ang naging problema. Pero even at the outset ay hindi naman talaga siya inaasahan na makakapag-raise ng malaking pondo para sa gobyerno. Dahil ang aim talaga niya ay para itama yung mga mali doon sa previous tax system natin. Yung bukod sa train law ay meron din yung recently passed na create law na yun naman nagfo-focus doon sa buwis na ibinabayad ng mga korporasyon. Kasi sinasabi nila na masyado daw mataas yung 30% na corporate income tax rate sa Pilipinas at isa yun sa mga dahilan kung bakit hindi masyadong maraming mga negosyo ang pumapasok sa ating bansa. Dahil sa mga karatig bansa natin, di hamak na mas mababa yung corporate income tax rate at yun yung itinama nung create law na pirmahan before the pandemic.
So, based dito sa kwento ni JC, makikita that the tax reform program of the Duterte administration was actually unable to aid or withstand economic problems that can happen here and there. So, parang inayos yung pag-implement sa isang sistema na in the first place and at its core was regressive nga. So, very superficial kumbaga yung mga naging reformang ito. At kung hindi man ay counterintuitive pa nga. Instead of lessening the burden of the taxpayers, mas nagsanhi pa ng ibang problemang pang-ekonomiya. Interestingly, while the Train Law wanted to somehow lessen the income tax burden of the people, the current government also passed a law that will decrease corporate tax. No? Ito yung sabi ni JC, yung Create Law na naipasa kamakailan. No? So the government wanted to decrease corporate tax supposedly to encourage investment.
So, ang tanong, kung binabaan ng income tax at binabaan din ng corporate tax, saan naman gagaling ang government revenue? So, ako ang takeaway ko dito ay talagang deadly combination ang populism at liberalism. Lalo na sa usapang pang-ekonomiya. They wanted to gain the favor of the people, of the taxpayer, but they also wanted to liberalize the economy by lessening taxes and tariffs. So, hindi pwedeng sabay yun. In fact, in other historical periods, may kita that when the economy is in trouble or is in recession, ang ginagawa talaga ay mag-impose ng mas mataas na tariff. Ganyan yung nangyari in the immediate post-war period, halimbawa. So, yung prescription ng United States, bumaliktad. Kasi nakikita nila na nasa danger zone yung growth rate ng Pilipinas at this period. Kapag nangyari yon, dati ang lagi nilang prescription ay liberalize, 'di ba? More liberalize ng trade, wag mag-impose ng tariff, etc. Kaya lang nakita nila that the domestic industry was suffering, yung economic growth ay bumababa. So anong pinaprescribe nila ngayon? I-increase yung tariff, Kasi nga, kailangan talaga ng gobyerno ng revenue, kailangan niya ng pera. Also, in the 1990s, may kita that the Philippines actually lagged behind our neighbors in terms of growth, like Thailand. And political economist Walden Bello would point to the overly free market at mababang import tax that became injurious to the economy. So ngayon, etong initiative ng Duterte administration to lessen corporate tax, it actually imploded when the pandemic struck. So sabi ni JC, nung nangangailangan na ang gobyerno ng pera para sa pandemic response at ayuda, wala na. Kasi nga mababa ang revenue because of the decreased corporate tax rate.
So kung ganito yung problema, ang tanong ngayon ay what should be done regarding the tax system in the Philippines? Let's listen to JC.
Gusto natin makita in the future na mas makamasa, mas progressive yung mga tax measures na makikita natin concretely na mababawasan yung tax burden, especially on the poorest segments of our population. And at the same time ay taasan yung tax burden doon sa pinakamayaman na parang lumalabas na sila pa yung nakaka-benefit na marami silang tax savings, especially for example doon sa train law. Nakita natin na parang yumaman pa nag-benefit yung mga mayayaman imbis na yung mahirap yung nag-benefit.
So tax the rich, ika nga, 'di ba? So ngayon, papalapit ang eleksyon, kailangan nating makita ano yung tax agenda or tax platform ng mga kumakandidato. But aside from that, aside from a more progressive tax system and a more progressive tax reform, tingin ko urgent din yung mas general na plano on budget and fund allocation. Kanina nabanggit ni JC yung very serious problem of mismanagement, which by the way is also a form of corruption, which became very apparent in the current COVID crisis. No? Kasi yung pagdapa ng ekonomiya, nangyari naman yan sa buong mundo. But the Philippines really suffered relative to our neighbors in Southeast Asia. So kung tingin ko naman, it is safe to say that mismanagement and misprioritization of the government are to blame. Ito yung analysis ni JC sa nangyaring economic tragedy sa Pilipinas ngayong pandemya.
At maraming ekonomista ang nagsasabi na bago ka makapag-expect ng pagbangon ng ekonomiya ay kailangan ayusin mo muna yung health response mo. This is first and foremost a health crisis. At hindi mo maaasahan ang pag-recover kung palpak yung iyong pandemic response. Kita nga natin, napaka-obvious na palpak nga yung health response. Even up to this day, nakita natin na doon pa lang sa basic components ng health response tulad ng testing, contact tracing, tsaka ng treatment ay hanggang ngayon parang hindi nakatutok Parang nag-give up na lang sila sa ganung essential components. For example, tingnan mo yung testing. Nung height nitong wave ng Delta variant ay lagpas-lagpas 20% yung positivity rate natin na isang malaking senyales na kulang talaga ang test na ginagawa araw-araw na umaabot siya 60 to 70,000 per day. Pero sinasabi ng mga health experts na siguro dapat 200, 250,000 or higit pa in one day. Sa kasamaang palad, doon sa 2022 budget, mandakin mo na walang budget para sa mass testing na inilaan. So parang doon pa lang parang obvious na parang sinukuan na nila yung pandemic response. And maging doon sa contact tracing na hanggang ngayon ay parang malaking joke na lang ito pagpasok mo sa mga malls, sa mga establishmento na nagkukunwari ka na lang na nag-fill out ng mga forms. Pero wala talagang, pati yung mga shop owners ay tinatamad na rin na mag-monitor kasi parang hindi rin naman talaga effective. And this is not to say na hindi na importante yung contact tracing. Importante pa rin talaga siya and kailangan siyang pondohan. Pero again, pag suriin mo yung 2022 proposed budget ay walang budget para sa contact tracing. And then of course, yung sa treatment, nakita natin na kapag may bagong wave ay linya-linya yung mga ambulansya sa harap ng mga ospital. Parang kailangan mo mag-hospital hopping bago ka maka-admit sa emergency rooms. So, kulang talaga. Doon sa 2022 budget, I think merong pondo para sa pagpapatayo ng mas maraming hospitals and to accommodate more beds. Pero for example, of course, napaka-importanting component niyan yung pagbabayad mo ng compensation doon sa health workers, doon sa special risk allowance, doon sa iba't iba sa meal and transportation and accommodation na allowances nila. Pero wala rin sa 2022 budget. So nasaan na yung ganitong klaseng essential components ng pandemic response?
Yeah, so aside from the health response, dapat din talagang magbuhos ng pera sa ayuda. So sabi nga ni JC, it should be treated not just as a social service, ano? Hindi lang sa serbisyo publiko, pero it should also be seen as an economic stimulus because you need to enable people to buy stuff. So imagine, more than 50% ang share ng service sector sa employment ng Pilipinas. Pero ano bang sektor ang pinakatinamaan ng pandemya, di ba? Restaurants, hotels, airlines, malls. So sobrang dami talagang nawalan ng trabaho. So this is not just a question of helping the needy It is also an economic strategy, ika nga.
So kawing-kawing na itong mga usapin ng Philippine economy from infrastructure projects to government expenditure, from taxation to budget allocation. Sobrang komplikado at talagang di natin ito mapag-uusapan lahat in just one episode. Pero siguro, pahuli na lang, pakinggan natin si JC about the things that we should look for in the candidates' platforms regarding the economy this coming election.
Pina-prioritize yung health response. Hindi talaga pa ito mawawala, especially with the new variants na lumalabas bigla, na parang it upends everything, na parang kala mo okay ng lahat tapos biglang hindi pa pala. So kailangan at least for as long as nandiyan yung pandemic, kailangan pa rin natin ng testing, contact tracing, sufficient treatment, and then yung vaccines. Yan yung mga kailangan bukang bibig ng mga kandidato paparating sa May 2022. To some degree, kailangan pa rin talaga ng ayuda. Na kapag hindi mo marinig yung ganyang mga magic words ay parang maalarma ka na bakit hindi niya binabanggit ito. Kapag of course, nandiyan yung mga politiko na magfo-focus sila dun sa corruption, yung family issue ay siguro malaking bagay na i-raise din. Pero wag nating kalimutan yung basics nung pandemic response na for the longest time has been ignored by the present government.
And that's it. Ayan yan ang mga bagay na kailangan hanapin natin sa mga kandidato para ma-ensure at least yung springboard toward a more inclusive economic growth, which since the dawn of colonization has been very, very elusive in the Philippine society.
Thank you for joining us today. If you want to listen to the full interview with JC Punongbayan, available yan sa aming website. So head over to www.podcast.org.
And if you like this conversation, share nyo naman sa friends nyo sa social media at follow nyo na rin kami. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
So see you next week and have a good day.